Hey everybody, welcome back to The Practice. This is that time of the week where we meet with our small identity groups in order to put into practice those things that we're talking about on Sundays. This week, Hope has joined
Yet again.
She's liking this time that we have. She likes the practice.
Yeah.
So today we want to talk about what happened on Sunday, but that's funny because this is actually before last Sunday.
That's right.
We're making this video early because Jay is going to be in El Salvador.
Right.
And we're just going to trust that this past Sunday, it looked remarkably different.
Yes.
I believe. Than it had in the past. Because we were talking last time about changing our church culture on Sundays.
Right.
So we're trusting that it was a miraculous change.
Absolutely. Because we're going through Ezra and Nehemiah, and we're talking about how in the story, you know, the big story here, they're coming back from exile, and now they're rebuilding their spiritual life, and they are rebuilding their faith, and in many ways starting to really get serious about their faith. And so we're finding some lessons from this that we can apply to us and things that we can learn and take on. And so what we talked about last week was like in this corporate worship. What does corporate worship look like? Because corporate worship is important to God. And there's something special that happens when you're in a room with a dozen or 100 or 300 other followers of Jesus, and we're all worshiping God together. There's something very significant that happens in our hearts in that moment. So corporate worship is really important. And so that's why we were wanting to look at the example that was happening in Ezra and Nehemiah when they're coming together and they're raising their hands before the Lord. They're falling on their face. They stand up to hear when the word of the Lord is shared. They stand but out of honor for God.
Right.
And so we are trying to raise the level of honor for God in our corporate worship services. Yeah. So if you were able to make a change, even in your heart, and it didn't work out in reality, but at least in your mindset, if you were able to change the way that you think about our corporate worship and at least try to elevate it like, no, this is important and I want to be present and give myself to it, then I just want to say thank you for that. Because as we come together and continually make those changes together, it does honor God and it's going to help our whole church.
Practicing. It's about practicing. We're not going to get it perfect.
Right.
We're trying to change our church culture in some very significant ways.
Right. So
it's going to take some time, effort, and we're going to have to practice.
Right. So as we were talking about, you know, kind of our corporate worship experience, we kind of want to go now this week, and we want to come down to our small group experience.
Yes.
You know, as you look at, even as we think about those exiles who were in Babylon, they're trying to hold on to their faith in the middle of this culture that is going on around them. And then they come back from exile and they're trying to discover how do we live this life right here in this world and what is happening. And this, you know, you see this even throughout the scriptures of how do God's people follow God and have a community that is set apart, even when the culture around them is pulling them in all kinds of different directions.
Right.
And it's very similar to what we're going through today. I was reading just a really great kind of analysis of our current culture right now, just the different generations that are happening, and with Gen Z that is coming up and Generation Alpha after them. But how things are so different now in 2021 than they were back in 1970 or 1980s when many of us were growing up and becoming Christians. I know I'm dating a whole big chunk of our group here in the South, but if you think about what was happening 40 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, there was still a sense in our country that what was going on in church, that this was where the good and moral people were. And so if people were out doing crazy things, they kind of instinctively knew, I need to get to church because that's where I'm going to kind of get my life straight. And so we would invite people to church to have this experience with God. But over the last 30, 40 years, really what has started to happen is that as some of the technology has changed, the community, the globalization has, you know, come so much closer. We're hearing so many more things from all these different people. It's changing the way that this next generation is really feeling about our culture. And so they're deeply passionate about justice, about seeing things done right, about taking care of the planet, about making sure that people are held accountable for things. And so there's this pull towards morality, which is really interesting because there's a lack of morality in other areas, but a pull towards we have to do something. And yet they are starting to view church and Christianity as more of the problem, because this is where a lot of the scandals are and where a lot of the people are. I'm talking about the bigger, broader church in America. And so as we're engaging with this culture, we have to figure out, like, okay, well, how do we actually share the gospel in a way that is relevant to them, and share the gospel in a way that makes sense? It reminds me of kind of what was going on, not in maybe all the cities that we have letters to, but definitely in the city of Corinth. From all reports, Corinth was a crazy place. It was kind of like the worst of New York, LA, and Vegas all put together in one place. And with the temple worship, with the prostitution that surrounded the temple worship and all of that, it was, it was just really wow. It was wild. And yet there was this sense of the family in Corinth was really important. And so you did not do something that would kind of go against your family, even though what was going on around. And so as Paul is talking to the Corinthians, he's really urging them to love one another and treat one another as family, because that was a value that was really held up in their culture. And it's like, this is how you're going to show the church around, or the culture around you, that the gospel is real, is by bringing in this sense of, no, we treat one another better than the culture around us. And God's love and God's way is actually the way to do it. Paul wasn't really encouraging, like, you have to have your Sunday services that have to be perfect. Their Sunday services were crazy, really weird. But he was trying to get them to focus on the way that they treated one another and the way that they loved one another. And I think this is the same thing for us in 2022 in South Orange County, is that we have to take the gospel and make it reality in the way that we interact with one another and the way that we treat one another, which is why we have really been focusing on our small group culture for these last couple years, because we want to build up these communities of faith, these smaller groups of Jesus following Christians that have decided we are going to love one another and be with one another and support one another and care for one another, even in the midst of all this other stuff that is going on. Right. We're trying to move away from church being, it's like a YMCA membership or a gym membership where you're like, oh yeah, I go when I can. No, it's not that. No, this is the community that I live in so that I can practice all of the ways of living that Jesus lived and all the things that he did. And so that I can interact with other people and so that we can be set apart from our culture.
Right.
So your small group is so important and living all of that out.
Right. We are building a counterculture to the culture around us. And that's not just coming together on Sundays and where we do that.
Right.
It's what happens every single day and the way that we live in community with each other.
Right.
And that's why it's so important. We're trying to create a synagogue system. And it's really interesting how God does this. They had to create those synagogues because there was no temple worship.
Right.
It's very reminiscent of what happened during the pandemic.
Right.
We could not meet together. So what happened? We had to meet in these small groups because small groups are pandemic proof.
Right.
No matter what happens, if the building burns down,
right.
It's not going to change what happens in RSM.
Right.
That is the church that meets there. That's not going to change what happens in Ladera. We are the church. And this is what people are instinctively looking for.
Right.
I have a sneaking suspicion that this new emerging generation isn't looking for the megachurch. They're not looking for the big experience with the lights and the great band. And they can get that. Two of my favorite artists are coming to Anaheim in the next few months, in the coming year, and I could go to a great worship experience, anytime that I wanted to. But that's not what we're trying to provide. We're not trying to provide the stellar experience for people. We're trying to provide authentic relationship with God.
Right.
We are the micro church. You are the micro church that in which people can experience that. People have been looking for it forever, just even with way back in the 60s and the 70s. There was this hippie movement.
Right.
What were they looking for? They were instinctively looking for the Acts 2 life.
Right.
That's what they wanted. They wanted that true, authentic relationship with one another. Now, of course, they weren't going to get that because they had their sex and their drugs and their rock and roll. That was not going to produce the righteous life that God desires, right?
Right.
But we have what they desire.
Right.
You know, it reminds me of that the story of Bonhoeffer, where, you know, I can't remember if it's his brother or just another brother in the faith who was talking to Bonhoeffer, because Bonhoeffer was always preaching about, we've got to build this authentic Christian community.
Right.
Like, that was his big message.
Right.
And, you know, this guy came to him like, you're going too far with this.
But he had actually gathered all these people and that wanted to be serious about their faith, and they were all living together. Kind of as the Nazi movement was growing, he pulled these people aside into the country, and they found this big house, and they would get up every day and they would study the Bible together, and they would talk about discipleship, and they would help one another
Basically
in their faith. It was camp all all the time. Yeah. And so this guy came to him and was like, this is radical,
much.
but it's too radical. You're kind of going too far here.
Exactly. And
go ahead.
So
I know,
Bonhoeffer
we're both so excited about this.
Bonhoeffer takes them to this hill that overlooks the Nazi training camps.
Right.
And he says, you know, brother, whatever we do has to be as radical as what they're doing.
Right.
And I think we have to really take this to heart.
Yeah.
That, you know, these people, we know that gangs in America exist and came about because of the breakdown of the home, because of the breakdown of family. That was people instinctively looking for the brotherhood. Mm-hmm. We have the brotherhood.
Right.
But we are not, we have the authentic
We have the ability to have the brotherhood.
Exactly.
Right.
And we have to believe and keep it as an ideal.
Right.
That this living in community is what God had in mind all along.
Right. So what we want you to do is be able to now start thinking about, how do you interact with your small group?
Right.
What is your attitude towards your group? Because, you know, as I've talked about, you know, we do things out of habit and out of tradition from time to time. And, you know, those of us maybe that have been around the church for 15 or 20 or 30 years, you've been in a lot of Bible talks and a lot of small groups, and you're like, okay, great, which one am I in now? But I want to ask you to continually refine your attitude towards the people in your small group, towards your community. And how can you become more devoted to that particular group? Mm-hmm. Is the group getting together, do you see it as like, oh yeah, I'll go if I can? Or do you go, no, my spiritual community, this has got to be a priority in my life, and I will work my schedule around that. And here's when the group gets together, I will be there. Everything else I'll fit in around that if I have time. But your spiritual community has to come first. Mm-hmm. Are there any attitudes with the people in your group? Is there any resentment that you've allowed to slowly start to build? Or is there anything that you haven't talked about to somebody? Somebody maybe has hurt your feelings or offended you in some way, or you don't feel connected with them. Are you allowing that relationship to stay at a surface level? Or are you going to be willing to really take it deeper and have some great honesty and intimacy?
Right. We want it to register that we're talking about something different than what has been the norm of, you know, my small group, this, my, you know, whatever, I belong to this, whatever. No, we're trying to take it deeper.
Right.
And it can be that, you know, you have to look at yourself and go, you know, some people have been able to shake off the scatteredness of the summer. You know, when we started talking about it in September, we started regathering and talking about recommitting. And some people have been able to shake that off, and now they've been like, no, I'm back in my spiritual community, I feel. But some of us haven't.
Right.
And it's the end, now it's like the end of October.
Yeah.
So we just have to be able to look back and assess the past year. There have been great things that have happened in our small groups this year.
Right.
And there have been some things that didn't work. Now is the time to assess that. You know,
Right.
when we started the year talking about what it would mean to belong to the South. right? What would it mean to belong? And we created this handout of love, give, serve, and share. And we sort of boiled down what it means to be a member of the South Orange County Church into these 4 categories. And we want to talk about these 4 categories again, now that we're ending the year,
Right.
in how we become those things.
Right.
You know, this is what it would mean to belong. Now, how do we become the people that we need to be able to have those things?
Right.
The first one is love, which does mean belonging to a local community that is not dependent upon the building. It's not dependent upon full-time staff, but just dependent on Christian living. I look back at the first century church, and you know, it's most historians that look back at that early church, they say that the way that they converted people was through their hospitality.
Yeah.
They weren't allowed to meet together. They still tried. They had the catacombs. They tried to do that, but they certainly didn't live off of that. That was not their spiritual life, because they weren't allowed to have it. Now we allow to have it, and it can become a crutch to us, and it can become a false sort of security for us, and it's not the full deal. Really, we can convert this next generation who is looking for authentic faith and authentic, as their families fall apart, they're looking for a family that stays together.
Right.
As their culture falls apart, they're looking for a culture that stands forever. And that's what we are trying to become. That's what love means in
Right.
our love, give, care. I mean,
Love, give, serve, and share.
Yeah.
Right. That's good. So as you think about this in your group tonight, and you talk about it with your group, I want you to be mindful, and I want you to be honest about ways that you can grow in your love and your devotion for your small group. Now, that might be difficult to actually admit in front of the other members of your small group, but I want to encourage you to at least be honest with yourself, even and make some internal changes. You may need to then make some public announcements to the group, like, you know what, I have not been prioritizing the group, or I do want to change and make this more of a priority. You know, when we go back through Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra was, good grief, that guy was desperate to get people to focus on the Torah, and he's doing everything he can.
Man, it was hard work.
It was hard work.
And Nehemiah.
And then he turns around and it's like, oh wait, now all these people that I led back, and now they're intermarrying with all these people who are worshiping other gods, and they're starting to worship other gods. Wait, that's why we were in captivity. And he's like,
you don't remember this?
What do you hear when I talk? And Nehemiah's like giving everything he can to build the wall and fight off the people who are coming after them.
All that opposition that we talked about on Sunday.
Right. And then he turns around and people are like, these guys aren't really opposing us. They can actually hear, yeah, come on in. They can live with us. And
they're like doing business on the Sabbath and setting up their stuff in front of the gate so they could sell it on the Sabbath. And Nehemiah's like, what in the world?
So you see and leaders, those of you that are small group leaders, be aware of that. When you are trying to lead people somewhere, there's going to be some people that respond with like, yes, and they will stand up and honor the word of the Lord. And there are other people who are going to be going out the back gate because they're like, whatever, I can't really be bothered with that. So from a leadership perspective, you gotta be aware that people are going to respond in different ways. But for all of us, I want you to ask the question, how am I responding to this call? This call to love, this call to really let my small group be a spiritual community that is set apart. How are you responding? Are you one of the ones who is standing up and raising your hands and falling in your face and praising God? Or are you one of the ones who's kind of going out the back and letting a lot of different compromises come in? So I want you to be aware of that and think of that. God has something really awesome planned for us if we will take hold of it.
Amen.
And so becoming like him, that's how we're going to take hold of it. So, hope you have some great discussions in your groups.
Woo-hoo!
And we look forward to, actually this next Sunday then is Salt Sunday.
Yeah,
So
it's going to be Salt
a
Sunday.
great time with your groups this coming Sunday, and I know you're going to have a wonderful time. So, we love you guys.
See ya.